Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Boss, Dragon of the Southern Tier. I'm happy to be here with you today as we're going to be addressing what we believe is the biggest news story of 2021. It's bigger than the lie of 2013 under President Obama, and keep your doctor. It's bigger than the rise of inflation at a 40-year high. It's more important than the Iran nuclear deal, the potential of invasion of Taiwan by China, of the Ukraine being annexed and basically given over to Russia in an act of appeasement. Now, we believe this may be the biggest news story and the least reported news story of all of 2021, perhaps maybe even in a decade. And we want to address this for you because we've spoken about it before on this channel, and we want to re-emphasize it based on the latest information that we have. But before we get started, we do want to say, if this is the first time that you are seeing our channel, we welcome you and we thank you for joining us. We want you to know that we do long-form political commentary, and every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, DLive, all the social media that we can to hear your voice in chats and tweets and texts and phone calls from anywhere in the world to talk about the issues that affect us all and are important to each and every one of us, because we believe in your right to free speech. Whether the government or any government believes that or not, whether the internet overlords like that or not, we believe in your unalienable right to speak, and we look forward to you sharing that with us every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's get to the point, the matter at hand, the big issue that we believe is the biggest lie that has been said perhaps in a decade, and underreported in all of the United States media, though not as underreported around the world. An issue that has affected international policy and will continue to impact international policy perhaps for decades to come. What we're speaking about is the actions of the United States government under the Biden-Harris administration in reference to Afghanistan, and specifically the Americans that were left behind in Afghanistan. Now, you may recall that back on August 25th, the Biden administration took a strange position in stating suddenly that the United States, in retreating from Afghanistan under the Biden-Harris administration, in its efforts to rush out of that nation as the Taliban swept and took control, that there were Americans in Afghanistan. Previous numbers had said somewhere between 10 to 15,000. On August 25th, we were told by Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State under the Biden-Harris administration, that there were roughly 1,500 Americans that were left in Afghanistan, and that we would get them all out, and they would all be able to return back to America. That's what the promise was at the time. Just 6 days later, that promise changed, because it was on August 31st that Joe Biden spoke to the American people and the world and stated with clarity that there was an extreme and extraordinary success in the evacuation, the retreat from Afghanistan, and the new rule of the Taliban. That America had made history in leaving behind somewhere between 100 to 200 Americans in Afghanistan who did not want to be in Afghanistan. That was very clear. It was stated very directly. In fact, we know that on September 2nd, there were many questions by Americans asking who was left in Afghanistan. The numbers did not make sense. We had gone from, in July, somewhere between 10 to 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan, to August, where we were told that there were some 6,000 Americans in Afghanistan, to then being told that 5,584 Americans had been returned home, and another 100 to 200 were left out in the void. to struggle against the Taliban, ISIS, and Al Qaeda. The numbers did not add up. The math did not make sense. And yet, while people were questioning this, we were told by the mainstream media and the Biden-Harris administration that we were wrong, that there were no more than 100 to 200, more likely 100 Americans that were left in Afghanistan. Looking at the factcheck.org and speaking about this, they emphasize and reiterate the fact that there were 100 to 200 Americans in Afghanistan. Quote, "We believe there are still a small number of Americans, under 200, and likely closer to 100, who remain in Afghanistan and want to leave. We're trying to determine how many," said Secretary of State Antony Blinken in an August 30th speech. That was the conversation that was being had with the American people. That's what the assurance was given to the American people, that if anyone remained in Afghanistan, they wanted to remain there. This is not true. That of the people who didn't want to remain in Afghanistan, it was merely about 100 people who had successfully, as part of the extraordinary success, gotten everyone out that was possible. Except that wasn't exactly true. You see, we did learn that, as reported by the Business Insider on September 27th, there are 100 Americans still trying to get out of Afghanistan. That's interesting, because we had been told that there were only maybe 100 Americans still in Afghanistan. And yet, even after getting out 85 Americans between September 1st and September 27th, another 100 Americans remained in Afghanistan. So we have to ask the question, how many Americans were actually in Afghanistan? How many people had been abandoned by the Biden-Harris administration? And let's be very clear here. They were abandoned. It was shortly after September 5th that all Americans in Afghanistan ceased to be discussed by the Biden-Harris administration. They ceased to be mentioned in all of the news media in America. It was rare, if at all, that we heard any mention that there were Americans potentially or actually in Afghanistan. It became a non-statement, kind of like the recovery under the Obama administration. Suddenly, words like stimulus were no longer being used. Well, Afghan Americans in Afghanistan no longer was being used, no longer referred to. No major news media source would address this subject, even as we learned more and more information. And we learned that the extraordinary success quoted by the Biden-Harris administration was based on a lie, because Americans were still in Afghanistan. And this is the primary purpose of any government, to protect its people, both domestically and abroad. There is no greater purpose of any government of any type than to protect its citizens. And yet, the Biden-Harris administration failed. And the news media did not care. They allowed those Americans to be unknown. To give it some perspective for those who are a little bit older, imagine that when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over Iran and captured 400 Americans, which created the Iran hostage crisis under President Jimmy Carter, imagine if the news media just stopped speaking about it. That those Americans were never referred to in the year that they were held in Iran. They were never mentioned. They were never discussed. They were just forgotten. That's something in history we could not possibly imagine. Imagine if, in America, if all of the riots in America were never spoken about, if the riots after Rodney King, the protests after Rodney King, were never mentioned. Could you ever imagine that? And how is this any less or any different? These are American citizens, brothers and sisters of Americans, fathers and mothers and children of Americans. And they were left alone by themselves in a nation controlled by the Taliban, a terrorist organization. surrounded by and supported by ISIS, a terrorist organization, and Al Qaeda, a terrorist organization, each and every one of them responsible for and demanding the death of American citizens, many of them funded by Iran, which has sworn the absolute death of all Americans. And again, your political preference makes no difference in this. No matter what you personally believe about your politics, they don't care. They want you dead. For reasons such as they believe in killing anyone who is gay or transgender. They believe in stoning to death women for being raped or for learning how to read. These are the atrocities that Americans commit every day in supporting those who are LGBTQ+, in supporting women being able to work, read, and to determine their own lives. For these reasons alone, the Taliban, ISIS, and Al Qaeda are willing to kill American citizens and have done so for many decades. And this is the environment that hundreds of Americans, perhaps thousands of Americans, were abandoned to. And no one was speaking about it. The news media ignored it. You could not get any elected official that was a Democrat to speak about this subject. We have asked multiple times of Representative Antonio Delgado of the New York 19th District to speak about this. He refuses. We have asked members of the New York State government, the governor, many elected officials, members of Congress to speak on this, to address the concerns and the safety of these Americans overseas. We have yet to ever receive a response since September 1st. And that brings us to a really interesting question. Because what we found out, the State Department, thousands of U.S. residents still stuck in Afghanistan. This is a story from foreignpolicy.com, a respected and reputable international agency. And they're speaking about the 14,000 U.S. legal permanent residents in Afghanistan. And that's what the story became, a discussion of people, of the residents, of individuals with green cards, and the SIV, or individuals in Afghanistan that worked alongside the United States government for over 2 decades. The conversation ignored consistently any and every American citizen that might be in Afghanistan, because there were only 100, we were told. Actually, at some points, less than 100 American citizens. And we were told consistently that that every effort was being used to get them home. How true was that information? Well, as we reported, that isn't true at all. And we could see that. Because when we look at international news media that does still consider this to be an important issue, we know that as late as October 26, the Pentagon admitted 450 Americans were still in Afghanistan 2 months after the fact. Now, that's an incredible statement. And it's something that we did not hear in any of the major news media in the United States. It's a story that hasn't been told. It's a story that will not be told. Even when major news media have been asked directly about this, there has been no answer. The Biden-Harris administration have eliminated discussion of Afghanistan from their talking points. It's almost impossible to hear anyone mention this. When the Pentagon made this announcement, there were 0 news stories on this. Can you imagine that? We saw that Joe Biden, head of the United States in the Oval Office, looked at the American people directly and lied to their faces, saying that there were 100 people that were left behind who wanted to come home. And he lied to the American people. And we know for a fact, as of October 26th, that the Pentagon confirmed over 450 people were in Afghanistan that are American citizens and had been abandoned by the American government, violating its purpose, the American government's purpose to protect American citizens at home and abroad. That is insanity. And that is shameful. That is the biggest story of 2021. That the American government has abandoned its purpose and its American citizens and allowed them to be in danger's way in nations dedicated to their death. 450 Americans. Imagine if it was you. Imagine if you had been forgotten by your government, that the highest levels of government refuse to even mention your name, that everyone in that political party, because of their political bias, refuse to even acknowledge your existence. How is that not the biggest story in America? And we have to go overseas to hear about this story, to hear this news, something that we continued to discuss since September 1st, repeatedly. And we continue to have said, we need to get our American citizens back home safely and alive, that it should be the number one priority of the American government. And yet it was not. And that we have learned that even though in late September, we were told there were less than 100 Americans still in Afghanistan, that we know that over 234 Americans had been extracted and brought back home, that another 439 are in the wind, as reported by news media. This is from the Daily Mail in the United Kingdom. So our government lied to our face, and the news media made it possible. The American news media didn't address this story, didn't tell the American people the truth. They buried the lead. They buried the story as deeply as they possibly could. But maybe that was the end. Maybe after the efforts in October, when the Pentagon released the information and we knew there were at least 450 Americans that were still in Afghanistan and still in danger's way, that these Americans would be removed. But that's not the case, because the story of Afghanistan did continue to be told. We were told about the Afghan citizens. We were told about women in Afghanistan. We were told about all the visa holders and those Afghans who need our help desperately. The news media was more than happy to mention that there are potentially 250 Afghan citizens that needed to leave to protect them from the Taliban. But at the same time, they made no mention of the American citizens that remained in Afghanistan. We were told that we had to take in refugees, that we had to take in the SIV holders who had helped America for 2 decades. And alongside them, at the very same moment, were American citizens that remained lost, thrown and tossed aside, discarded without any mention. Even as we were told that there are Afghans that we have to bring to America, no concern was made for the Americans that we had to bring back home. Why is that the case? How is this not the most incredible story? But I want you to understand, it continues. As evacuations from Afghanistan slow to a trickle, some, quote, at risk, end quote, allies may face a long road to the United States. U.S. allies? What about U.S. citizens? We were told there are 450 Americans from the Pentagon that are still in Afghanistan at least, and they are in harm's way. What about those people? What about those fellow American citizens? Why are we not speaking about their risk? Why are we not talking about bringing them home? Why are we not calling out the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the executives of the United States, in the highest office in the world? Why are we not criticizing them for doing nothing? In fact, doing less than nothing, because they aren't this is not being spoken about. No one in the media is asking about this. Looking at the story from the Washington Post, reported yesterday, December 12th, at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The story by Karen DeYoung and Missy Ryan. What do we see in this story? Since the final military plane departed on August 31st, the Biden administration officials from the president down have repeatedly pledged to continue helping all, quote, at risk, end quote, Afghans left behind? What about the American citizens? How about since August 31st, there have been hundreds of American citizens, if not thousands of American citizens that have been left at risk. What about them? Why are they not being addressed? Why are they being ignored? Why is this being minimized? Why is the purpose of the United States government being obfuscated by political partisanship? Think about this. But the fairly indiscriminate fire hose of departures in August has now become a painfully slow drip of prioritized passengers. U.S. organized charter flights that began in late September have evacuated only about 3,000 Afghans when compared with tens of thousands in August. What about American citizens? 3,000 Afghans, not American citizens. What about the American citizens that are in Afghanistan and cannot come home, that have been abandoned? They won't even mention them in this news story from the Washington Post on December 12th. Hundreds of American citizens, perhaps thousands of American citizens, will not even be mentioned. Instead, we're talking about Afghan citizens. That isn't the priority of the American government. That is not the purpose of the American government. Let's go on. Looking at the story, and if you look very carefully, you will find, I believe, 2 instances where American citizens are actually even mentioned. One of those statements is here. The administration says the process is now limited by the realities on the ground in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, along with the constraints of U.S. immigration law and its own capacity to deal with the situation. It is prioritizing U.S. citizens and residents with special immigrant visas, or SIVs, in their Afghan passports, indicating that they had worked as interpreters or in other capacities for the U.S. government or have progressed beyond a certain point in the SIV application process. Understand that statement. They're talking about 3,000 Afghans being sent to America, that we are getting Afghan citizens and SIV holders, individuals who worked with the American government. They're trying to bring that back home. And as a side note, they acknowledge that American citizens beyond the 450 that remain in Afghanistan need to come home. It is prioritizing U.S. citizens. The priority is getting the remaining U.S. citizens months after the fact. 4 months after we were first evacuating American citizens, they remain in harm's way, in danger. And the news media will not mention them. They are an afterthought, a side note, barely worth mentioning and barely worth addressing. This is insulting. Going on in the story and buried deeply in this story, you have to dig all the way down in this story. How many paragraphs did we just go through? How many pages of news coverage do we have to go through to finally reach this statement from the Washington Post on December 12th? The administration has said that all of the American citizens it knows of in Afghanistan have now left or been given an opportunity to leave. If that were true, then why in this statement are they saying, which we have to find and was also buried, that the priority are U.S. citizens in Afghanistan? If they are a priority, that means they want to leave, that they have indicated they have a desire and a request to leave Afghanistan, which is no surprise considering that the Taliban, the ISIS, and Al-Qaeda are looking to kill those American citizens. And yet we are told that they are already gone. We are prioritizing. How can you prioritize bringing back home American citizens that have already left? If there are no American citizens that exist in Afghanistan, then why are they a priority to remove from Afghanistan? Does this make any sense? Do you believe this? As reported by the Washington Post, the Biden-Harris administration is now telling us that there are no Americans in Afghanistan, just like they told us in August and in September that all Americans except for 100 had been removed. And that was a lie, and a pattern that we have seen consistently under the Biden-Harris administration. We are seeing that statements are being made, and then months after the fact, in a byline secondary story, we are finding out that what we were told is a lie. How is this not the biggest story of 2021? How is this not the most important news for American citizens to consider? That the government has, in our faces, lied to the American people. It has endangered the lives of American citizens. And it continues to allow those American citizens to exist in danger and has ignored them and refuses to even mention them. They will not discuss it, even when asked directly, as we have asked Representative Antonio Delgado, refuses to even mention them or their situation. Why is this the case? How is this allowed to happen? Imagine, again, I must ask, imagine if this was your mother, your father, your brother or sister, one of your children. What if this was affecting your family? Would you want the American government to completely disavow your existence? To value you as a secondary or side matter? That the news media would not address your life and your plight, even as you are in danger? That the American government would disavow the very purpose of government, of every government, to protect its people domestically and abroad. And they know they are in danger because they're trying to bring Afghans, not American citizens, not even those Afghani people who have worked with the United States government, but just other random Afghan citizens, and they're trying to bring in hundreds of thousands to the United States. What about the hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans that are in Afghanistan? And by the way, we are also told that as of December 6th, the United States has brought 470 citizens and 417 residents, along with their families, into the United States. So we are aware that more, so it isn't even just 450 Americans, at least 470 American citizens. The numbers continue to grow. The numbers continue to increase every time this story is being spoken about. And yet, the news media will not headline this. The Biden-Harris administration will not address this. Members of the Democratic Party will not acknowledge the existence of these American citizens. This is as big as any story that has ever existed about American presidents. That the American president and the executive branch have lied to America, that they have misrepresented the truth, that they have allowed American citizens to be in danger. And as we enter 2022, we have no reason to believe that every American has been brought back home. Again, we were told in June and July that 10 to 15,000 American citizens were in Afghanistan. That was later revisioned to 6,000. If it were actually 6,000, perhaps every American has been brought home. And if that were the case, why are we looking at prioritizing U.S. citizens in being taken from Afghanistan now? After we have been told 470 Americans have already come home. After we have been told that these American citizens, there are no American citizens left in Afghanistan. And if there are no American citizens left in Afghanistan, then why is the Washington Post in the same exact article telling us that U.S. citizens are being prioritized in being able to be brought back home? In the very article published by the Washington Post on December 12th, they are conflicting the information they are telling the American citizens, and they are burying the story as deeply as they possibly can to hope that you will not notice the discrepancy, that there is an inherent lie that is being told to you. If there are no Americans in Afghanistan, then there is no need to emphasize and prioritize bringing back home people with U.S. passports. Why are we emphasizing that? There is a discrepancy here. You are being lied to. The Washington Post is complicit in this. CNN, NBC, MSNBC, even Fox News, look at whatever media source you would like, and they are complicit in this disgrace against the American people. There is, in our opinion, no bigger lie that has been made, and there is no bigger cover-up than what we are seeing present. The Biden-Harris administration continued to try and sell the idea that everything with Afghanistan in 2021 was an extraordinary success. That is a lie. They have tried their very best to tell us over and over again that American lives were not in danger, and they have been, and we believe they continue to be. We have been told over and over again these numbers keep growing, that every number that they have told us month after month has only grown every single month. And we have learned this information primarily from outside the United States, not within it. Perhaps you think that this isn't a big issue. Perhaps you think that the news media has appropriately provided information on this. Let us ask you a simple question. If the Biden administration is willing to lie to the American people about the lives of American citizens in danger, what is the Biden administration not willing to lie about? What is the Biden-Harris would not tell you? If they're willing to break the actual purpose of government, if they are willing to deny the safety of American citizens domestically and abroad, what else are they willing to do? What ally can truly trust the United States? What enemy of the United States needs to fear anything about the United States? If we're not willing to protect our own citizens, if we're not even willing to be honest about the danger our citizens exist in, if this is something that is willing to be buried for the purpose of political pandering to try and give a boost to the approval rating of the Biden-Harris administration, if that is more important than American citizens, then what else matters? What else can you trust? Perhaps you think that this is not as big a story as we believe, but we will stay adamant. We have been talking about these American citizens because we have not forgotten them. We do not want them to ever be forgotten, and we do not want the news media to think that they have gotten a pass on this, that it's okay to ignore American citizens in peril anywhere in the world. And it has nothing to do with political preference. It has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with the fact that America exists for a reason. Our government has its first and primary purpose in protecting the American people. And we want to see that done. No matter who sits in the Oval Office, no matter what party controls the Congress, that is the purpose of the American government, and it must be taken care of. And the news media has its obligation to speak about this until that purpose has been completed. We will continue to talk about this story and to look into this story to see how big the lie continues to grow until the rest of the media addresses this issue. We are very angry about this, and we believe every American should be angry about this. Do you believe the Biden-Harris administration? They have now said all Americans are out of Afghanistan. And any Americans that remain in Afghanistan have priority to leave Afghanistan. But they've already left. But they are a priority. What do you believe? What do you think is really happening? And why do you think the major news media of America refuse to address this issue. We look forward to seeing your comments.